The insane executions of the female guards of Bergen Belsen. Another day, another tragic story about a concentration camp. The Nazis must have considered everybody a bunch of rats that they could just crush under their feet and move on. No matter how much German sentiment has developed recently, they must admit they have an ugly past. The topic of today's video revolves around the concentration camps of Bergen Belsen and how their female guards were executed. So without further ado, let's get started. Bergen Belsen, often known as Belsen, was a Nazi concentration camp in what is now Lower Saxony, North Germany, southwest of the Bergen near Calais. First created as a prisoner of war camp, Elements became a concentration camp in 1943. Originally, this was an exchange camp where Jewish captives were kept in exchange for German prisoners of war imprisoned elsewhere. Later, the camp was enlarged to house Jews from other concentration camps. In 1935, the Wehrmacht began constructing a massive military facility in Belsen, a section of Bergen, in the province of Hanover. This became Germany's largest military training ground at the time and was utilized for armored vehicle training. In 1937, the barracks were completed. Since then, the camp has been in continuous operation and is currently known as Bergen-Hohne Training Area. The NATO military forces utilize it. The first building workers were held in camps near Fallingbostel and Bergen, and later being the so-called Bergen-Belsen Army Construction Camp. The workers' camp was decommissioned once the military complex was built in 1938 and 1939. Nevertheless, following the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Wehrmacht began utilizing the cottages as POW camps. Stalag 11B, a hooded camp in Fallingbostel, would become one of the Wehrmacht's largest POW camps, housing up to 95,000 prisoners from numerous nations. Belgian and French prisoners were imprisoned at the former Bergen-Belsen construction workers camp in June 1940. When Germany prepared to attack the Soviet Union in June 1941, this station was greatly extended, becoming an isolated camp for the Stalag 11C. 311. It was one of the three regional camps designed to house up to 20,000 Soviet prisoners. Was liquidated in the summer of 1943, and Bergen-Belsen became a branch camp of the Stalag 11B. Until January 1945, it operated as a hospital for all Soviet POWs in the vicinity. Additional inmates' patients included Italian military internees from August 1944, and when the Warsaw Uprising was crushed in October 1944. Around 1,000 soldiers of the Polish Home Army were imprisoned in a separate portion of the POW camp. The SS Economic Administration Office took over a portion of the Bergen-Belsen camp in April 1943. As a result, it became a component of the concentration camp system controlled by the SS Schutzstaffel, but it was an exception. Originally classified as a civilian detention camp, it was renamed a holding camp in June 1943, since the Geneva Conventions required the former kind of prison to be available for inspection by international committees. This waiting camp, or exchange camp, housed Jews who were to be swapped for German citizens incarcerated elsewhere, or for hard money. The SS split the camp into divisions for different groups. In March 1944, a section of the camp was renamed a rehabilitation camp, and inmates too sick to work were transferred from other concentration camps. They were meant to rehabilitate in Belsen before returning to their original camps and resuming work, but many of them perished there from disease, malnutrition, weariness, and a lack of medical treatment. In August 1944, a new sector was established, which became known as the Women's Camp. By November 1944, the camp had received around 9,000 women and young girls. Most of those who could work lasted only briefly before being transferred to other concentration camps or slave labor camps. The first women held were some Poles. In December 1944, SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer, who had previously served at Auschwitz-Birkenau, took over as camp commandant, succeeding SS Hauptsturmführer Adolf Haas, who had served since the spring of 1943. The SS took over the prisoner hospital and expanded Bergen-Belsen in January of 1945. At least 85,000 people were carried in cattle trains or marched to Bergen-Belsen when the eastern concentration camps were evacuated ahead of the Red Army's onslaught. Formerly, the number of inmates at Belsen had been substantially lower. In July 1944, there were 7,300. By December 1944, there were 15,000. And by February 1945, there were 22,000. By April 15th, 1945, the number had risen to over 60,000. Overcrowding resulted in a significant rise in disease fatalities, mainly typhus, as well as TB, typhoid fever, dysentery, and starvation in a camp built to house around 10,000 prisoners. The exchange convicts' unique status was likewise no longer applicable at this point. All detainees faced famine and diseases. According to current estimates, around 120,000 inmates went through the concentration camp during its existence from 1943 to 1945. Because the SS destroyed the camp archives, not even half of them, around 55,000, are known by name. As previously stated, the SS handled prisoners differently in different portions of the camp, with exchange camps inmates often receiving better treatment than other prisoners, at least initially. But in October 1943, the SS chose 1,800 Jews from Poland, with passports from South American nations, for their special camp. Because the governments of these countries largely refused to honor the passports, these persons were no longer valuable to the dictatorship. Male detainees in the rehab centers suffered significantly more from a lack of care, malnourishment, sickness, and mistreatment by guards. Many of them were killed. In the summer of 1944, the SS ordered phenol injections into at least 200 soldiers. Because the mass executions took place in camps further east, there were no gas chambers at Bergen Belsen, yet contemporary estimates place the death toll in Belsen at around 50,000 Jews, Czechs, Poles, anti-Nazi Christians, homosexuals, Roma, and Sinti, which are gypsies. When the British and Canadians moved on Bergen Belsen in 1945, the German army negotiated a truce and an exclusion zone around the camp to keep typhus from spreading. Heinrich Himmler decided to hand over the camp without a struggle on April 11, 1945. SS guards instructed prisoners to bury some of the deceased. The next day, officials of the Wehrmacht met with the British D Squadron of the Ends of Court regime at the bridge of Winsen and were taken to 8 Corps. On April 13th, at 1 a.m., an agreement was struck defining a neutral zone of 48 square kilometers around the camp. When British and Canadian soldiers eventually arrived, they discovered over 13,000 unburied dead and about 60,000 detainees, the majority of whom were very ill and malnourished. The detainees had gone days without food or drink before the Allied arrival, partly due to the American bombing just before and after liberation. Roughly 500 inmates died every day, largely from typhus. The BBC's Richard Dimbleby, who accompanied the British forces, recounted the images that greeted him, saying, "Across an acre of land there were dead and dying individuals. It was impossible to tell which was which. The surviving slept with their heads against the bodies, surrounded by a dreadful, ghostly parade of malnourished, idle individuals with nothing to do and little prospect of survival, unable to get out of your way, unable to look at the horrific things surrounding them. Infants, small wizened beings that couldn't live, had been born here. A mother, driven insane, yelled at a British guard to give her milk for her infant, thrusting the small mite into his arms before fleeing, screaming uncontrollably. As he unwrapped the bundle, he discovered that the infant had been dead for days. The Brits first permitted the Hungarians to stay in control, and only Commandant Kramer was captured. Following that, SS and Hungarian guards shot and murdered some hungry inmates attempting to obtain food supplies from the storehouses. The British began to offer emergency medical attention, clothes, and food. Soon after the liberation, the SS set up a satellite camp in the vicinity of the Army barracks, which became known as Hone Camp. In early April, around 15,000 convicts from Mittelbau-Dora were moved there. The female guards fled with the rest of the SS as the Allies reached Bergen Belsen. Nonetheless, some of them were apprehended by British forces and prosecuted for their crimes. 11 female guards were found guilty of war crimes and condemned to death by hanging in December 1945. The executions were carried out on December 13, 1945, in a specially erected gallows in the courtyard of the jail where they were housed. The killing of the female guards at Bergen Belsen were a minor but significant act of justice for Holocaust victims. It served as a reminder to those who were complicit in the genocide, whether male or female, will face the consequences. While remembering the atrocities of the Holocaust is vital, it is also crucial to remember that justice was delivered in some instances. Thank you for stopping by to watch. Please subscribe to the channel and post your video recommendations in the comments area if you want us to do more films like this.